Well, good afternoon. This is Kathleen Dudley coming from New Mexico, and I have the pleasure of interviewing uh, Professor Tim Canova. He is the professor of law at the Nova Southeastern University Shepard Board College of Law in Fort Lauderdale, and he teaches constitutional law. Now, Tim is a professor of law and public finance at this college, and he teaches constitutional law, the First Amendment law, corporations and business entities, regulation of financial institutions, and a seminar on law, finance, and markets at Nova. So, welcome, Tim, and I really appreciate this opportunity to have a conversation with you.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Well, thank you. So, Tim, you've mentioned a few things to me that, of course, really perked my ears. You mentioned that in the college, the law school, of 42 professors, you are the only one that didn't get vaccinated.
That's my understanding out of 45 professors, actually. Yeah. And the
45.
only reason, it sort of came to a head was that my university was the first private university in the country that was trying to mandate vaccines for everyone, faculty, staff, and students.
Wow.
And back in, I think it was April of 2021, there were no legal protections for us under Florida law. And I thought, well, this is something that the law faculty should really weigh in on. And I'd always been a believer in faculty governance. So I managed to get on the agenda for the faculty meeting a discussion about the university's vax mandate. And prior to the meeting, I circulated a 10-page memo to my colleagues with lots of sources and links about the dangers of the vaccine, the experimental nature of it, the CDC's VAERS website, the problems with the PCR tests, all aspects that you could imagine that I was concerned about. And it really floated like a lead balloon. And you could say I kind of outed myself as being against the vaccine. And there was only one other colleague who spoke up against the vax mandate, although he had regretted that he had gotten vaccinated, eventually regretted it. It's sort of a strange place to be. Florida has this reputation, deservedly so, for being perhaps the freest state in the country right now when it comes to a number of issues, including the vaccines. But it's a big state, and in South Florida, these are deep blue counties, Miami-Dade and Broward County in particular, but also Palm Beach County. And those pockets within the state, things were very repressive throughout much of the worst of the pandemic. There were shutdowns and a lot of mask mandates and attempts for vaccine mandates.
Well, and I bring that up because, of course, as a law professor in in a university level, you have a voice of that impacts tremendous amount of people. And in law, where we know the courts are no longer courts of justice, they're courts for profit. There you are teaching constitutional law, and so um, you have the attention of many young minds who are going out. They will eventually become bar attorneys, as you are, and yet we also know that 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 what we're up against is a tremendous system of a legal system that keeps justice from occurring. So how do you manage that as a professor of constitutional law in a college?
These are difficult times, and whether you're a professor at a law school or any other occupation, we're living in a time of mass propaganda and sort of historical amnesia, you could say. I try to remind my colleagues about the federal protections, the legal protections against coerced medicines, including the Nuremberg Code, and it made no headway. So I think the best we can do, whether somebody like me who's teaching and trying to engage with young minds, or any other occupation that we have, the best thing that we can do is to try to do our own research, try to remember the kinds of fundamental rights and the legal protections that we have and that are being eroded, and to speak the truth the best we can.
So, and do you find yourself limited in terms of your own free speech as a professor? And are you tenured in
I,
law school?
I am tenured. My first tenured appointment was at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and I've moved since then. And I am tenured here in South Florida. I find the discussions with my colleagues are the most difficult ones, where discussion is not encouraged, and not just at my law school, in the legal academy in general, among former colleagues at former law schools where I've taught in the past. There's more of that kind of almost like a cancel culture mentality, I think. I don't find it as closed when it comes to the classroom and engaging with my students. I let my students know very quickly that it's okay for them to disagree with me. It's not going to affect their grades in any way. And I think many of them very much appreciate being able to have open and frank conversations that maybe are lacking elsewhere.
That must be an unusual opportunity for them, and it's very good to hear.
But
You
thanks.
had mentioned in some communication recently with me that the First Amendment Constitution, which had been a required course at the university, is no longer a required course. Could you speak to that?
Yes. Last year, the dean of my law school circulated one study, just one, a law review article, and these law review articles are not even peer reviewed. They're pretty much edited by law students. So one law review article to reach the conclusion that there's no correlation between taking First Amendment law and passing the bar exam. And based on that, submitted it to our curriculum committee, which came forth with a proposal to remove First Amendment law as a required constitutional law class at my law school. I opposed that, and so did a number of other colleagues. But the faculty, by not a large majority, but by a majority, voted to go along with that plan and to remove First Amendment law as a required class. And I do see it as a sign of the times, when really academic elites and lawyers no longer value the kind of free, open speech protections that are embodied in the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is first for a reason. To have a representative democracy, you need an informed electorate, and having free expression of ideas is fundamental to that system working, to have a free marketplace for ideas. And instead we have propaganda and manufactured narratives and manufactured consent in this country.
Well, and also within the First Amendment is the right to redress government.
Well, that is true. The freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, the right to redress government for your grievances, all of this has been devalued, as we're supposed to be just passive consumers following orders. In many ways, the past few years, you could say the COVID era, and even maybe prior to COVID to some degree, it started to become more and more apparent that the society we live in maybe speaks a lot about democracy and freedom, but it's just a lot of hot air sometimes. That when the population bows to authority and won't think for themselves, that's an authoritarian mindset. And fascism and communism and authoritarian political movements require the consent of the population to have that mindset, to respect and obey authority without question.
Yes, and I've been listening to some United Kingdom constitutional law interviews recently, and there's a very big deal going on right now because Charles will be sworn in as the new king of the UK. And he is supporting Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and the World Health Organization, in essence, handing over the sovereignty of the people to those private corporations. And so there's a big pushback by the people there. And they're referencing the Magna Carta and within Article 61 being able to redress government without
Mhm.
backlash. And so here we are, we're going back to these very old documents. And
Mhm.
um, and thankfully, they're there because all of these elected officials or appointed officials have sworn an oath to uphold these old documents.
Mhm.
And do you have a response to those statements there?
Well, I agree with your analysis there. And our own elected officials from the very local county level up to our federal officers take an oath to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And yet we're living in a time where look at all of the constitutional violations that have occurred. Just in the COVID era, again, it's not just the First Amendment that got trashed. Fourth Amendment, protections against government surveillance. Fifth Amendment, protections against the government taking one's property without just compensation. Well, when you take a look at all those shutdowns that destroyed 1 out of 5 small businesses in this country, while the very large corporations got bigger and bigger. These are constitutional violations. There should be redress for that. There should be damages paid to the people who have suffered, and the elected officials who violated the Constitution. They broke the law. They didn't just break any law. They broke the most fundamental law. They broke the Constitution. They should be removed from office. They should be removed for violating their constitutional oaths. But of course, how do you accomplish that? When all of the branches of government seem to be complicit in this, the checks and balances between the branches have broken down.
Well, they have, but you bring up a number of important points there. Number one, you would think that 1 out of 5 of the population would be outraged and that they would be banding together en masse to
Right.
bring about restitution
Mm-hmm.
and, and using the Constitution. But why are they not? Because the Constitution hasn't been taught, right? And so people
That is
don't even
true.
know their rights. I mean, can you talk to that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, there are collective action problems. Millions of Americans, I'm sure, feel damaged and aggrieved by what has happened, but there are transactional costs in banding together and organizing together. And I think you're absolutely right that most Americans don't really understand their own form of government or the Constitution, the kind of protections that we have. And then the few that understand it and try to go to the courts to basically bring legal action to either stop the shutdowns or to be compensated for it. That's a very difficult road to go. To do it without an attorney is very difficult. It's like trying to walk into a dark room, blindfolded. And to find an attorney that's going to represent you and zealously represent you is very difficult. To find somebody who is not just going to try to take your money, somebody you can afford, and somebody who's going to not hold any punches and really litigate very hard for you. So there are lots of hurdles in the way of enforcing our rights.
Well, yes, there are. And it does not give us an excuse for not educating ourselves and empowering ourselves and learning about law. We have been discouraged. We've been programmed. I mean, there's over 43 million state statutes and rules and regulations, which is dizzying. And
Mm-hmm.
so, to think about learning the legal system is overwhelming. However, we can learn the lawful system, constitutional law, and and we must. I mean, how else? how else are we going to go forward and stop and have any chance of reclaiming our rights and stopping this tyrannical overthrow of the world?
Yeah, how else? Everybody's got to stand up and try to defend themselves and try to fight it out through all legal means possible. I've become somewhat more jaded and cynical, perhaps, in recent years, appealing to elected officials to try to have them, you know, do their jobs and uphold their oaths and advance the interests of the people seems to kind of fall on deaf ears. Political scientists have studied the system for so long, and they've described for many decades our system sort of as one of interest group pluralism. And those interest groups that are the most powerful are the corporations and their trade associations. And those interest groups are the ones that manage to influence and at times capture the levers of government. They do it through campaign contributions, through lobbying, and through revolving doors. And we see the revolving doors happening all the time, where government officials from really just about every branch of government will step down and take a much more lucrative job in the private sector. And lo and behold, usually for those industries that they were previously supposedly regulating.
Yes, and we've seen that for decades, as I recall. Um, so one of the things that really sticks in my craw is when I begin to hear something that apparently seems to come right out of the blue, and then I hear it repetitively, over and over and over, and all of a sudden I realize it hits me. And it's like this is a propaganda statement, and people are beginning to latch onto it. Now, I've been hearing it a lot about the Constitution, and this has been really bothering me. We know that the Constitution of the United States of America was corporatized and that the government is now a corporation. We know that. So that government that Constitution that was amended in 1791 to include the Bill of Rights, including the Article 6, clauses 2 and 3, which are so significant. We know that even that corporatized government swore an oath to uphold the original organic constitution, which was to hold it as the supreme law of the land. So everyone from that moment onward has been basically they're beholden to their sworn oath as to hold the original organic constitution as the supreme law of the land. Now, in saying that, I keep hearing from different groups of people that the Constitution means nothing. It has no value, no impact. Let's rewrite a new Constitution. Let's we have no protection. And the way, Tim, that I see that is I see people saying, we don't really understand our rights. We don't know the Constitution. We don't understand the Bill of Rights. And that they're listening to a dialogue that is a propaganda-based dialogue to further disempower them. Could you talk to that element?
I see it all the time. I even see it among colleagues. I see it among law professors. It really is a sort of a devaluation of the Constitution. And quite often it's based on slogans and not real analysis of the actual provisions of the Constitution. Is the U.S. Constitution a perfect document? Of course not. And it was not at the beginning a perfect document, but it probably is the best written Constitution that there ever has been. And as American society has gone through all kinds of convulsions over the centuries, including the Civil War, it's become a better Constitution as far as protecting our freedoms and liberties and providing some kind of a form of government. Although I think on that front, it's really kind of broken down. Much of the reason it's broken down is because if leaders are corrupt, it doesn't much matter how good the Constitution is. And we see this. We see it not just in the United States, Canada, Australia, around the world, where leaders just don't respect the basic fundamental freedoms of their own citizens anymore. And how do you fight that? I'm again somewhat at a loss as to what the path forward is. Elections seem to be quite often a contest between an establishment Democrat and an establishment Republican. The counting of the votes is far from transparent. You're not allowed to inspect the software of the electronic voting machines. That's considered trade secrets and proprietary software owned by a cartel of electronic election machine companies, and literally a cartel. Three companies that dominate the market, and all three companies are not even publicly traded corporations. They are owned by private equity funds. So the whole system really does seem like a scam. It's not the Constitution that's the scam. The Constitution, far from it, is probably our last great hope to reclaim our rights, our freedoms, and our democracy.
Well stated. And of course, if we're not educated, if we do not know our rights, then of course we're going to consider that it is failing us. Now, when we have electronic voting machines, maybe, Tim, could you speak to that? You were involved in an election. Was it 2016?
Yes,
Yes.
2016. I had never run for a public office before, and I found myself living in a district in South Florida where I was working with a group called the Citizens Trade Campaign. We were lobbying our local elected officials, our basically members of Congress. We were against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Obama administration was pushing this global trade agreement. It would further undermine American sovereignty. And, it was a coalition of labor, environmentalists, nationalists, people who really wanted to maintain our sovereignty over our own policies and our own lives. And our local congresswoman was the only Democrat in Florida's congressional delegation to vote to fast track the TPP. And we started to look for somebody who would challenge her in a primary. And I must confess that at the time I was a Democrat. I had been a lifelong Democrat.
I was too, I confess.
Okay. It was a different party then. It was still, I thought, the party of Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. And anyway, we couldn't find anyone to challenge the Congresswoman. And that's because the Congresswoman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, also was the chair of the Democratic National Committee. To make a long story short, I ended up jumping in January of 2016 and challenging her in the Democratic primary. The campaign went viral almost immediately because Wasserman Schultz had made herself quite controversial for tipping the scales for Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. And the campaign went viral. We started raising a lot of money, all in small donations online. I never took a penny from any corporate interests or any political action committees. Out of the blue, I think in May of 2016, I got an endorsement by Bernie Sanders. Had not been seeking it, had not been in touch with him or his campaign. It came out of the blue. And then, of course, in the summer of 2016, the WikiLeaks broke the DNC leaks. Sanders sort of faded and capitulated, and our campaign in the summer of 2016 was probably the most important primary campaign in the country at the time. We ended up raising almost $4 million, and we used the money to open up 4 field offices in the district, which we had quite a field operation. I think it was the largest field operation for any congressional campaign in the country. And we were knocking on about 12,000 doors a week and compiling good field numbers. And by the middle of the summer, we saw that the numbers were tipping in our favor. And by the end of August, it was a late August primary, it looked like we were running away with it, quite frankly. The day before the primary, the local NBC affiliate had up on its website a preview of the next day's primaries. All of them were zeroed out because no votes had been counted. But strangely, in my race, they had Wasserman Schultz defeating me by 13 percentage points with 69% of the precincts reporting. We took screenshots. We called up NBC. They never gave an explanation. They took it down. The next day, the polls closed, and Wasserman Schultz beat me by 13 percentage points. So I know much the same happened to Carrie Lake in Arizona 2 weeks before her race for governor. A Fox affiliate had the election results somehow. Anyway, I did not concede, and instead I sought to inspect the paper ballots. Again, there was no sense trying to look at the source code. You're not allowed to look at the software code. But under Florida law, ballots are public records, and we have a strong Public Records Act in Florida. And we even had state constitutional protection for public records. So I asked to see the paper ballots. Our view, at my expense, and our view was that if we counted up the ballots in some of the key precincts, we were thinking about a dozen precincts out of about 200 precincts. And if they matched up, I would concede. If they didn't match up, that's a whole nother story. Well, the supervisor of elections in Broward County at the time was a woman named Brenda Snipes, and she stonewalled our requests. I finally filed a lawsuit against Brenda Snipes and the Broward Supervisor of Elections office. And the lawsuit moved forward to the pretrial discovery stage. And that's when we discovered 3 months into the lawsuit was when Brenda Snipes ordered the destruction of every paper ballot. These are violations of federal and state law, including felony violations punishable by up to 5 years in prison. And we were shocked when they admitted this. We had sworn videotaped deposition testimony of Snipes admitting to it. We had documentary evidence they had to turn over that showed they had destroyed the ballots. They had no excuse except, oops, we made a mistake. It was not believable at all. The judge granted me summary judgment, but all we got were attorney's fees. There was no other relief they could really give us since the ballots were gone. But in the judge's 10-page order, he really listed out the state and federal statutes that had been violated. And we thought at that point that the supervisor of elections would get fired and investigated, and that the investigation maybe would lead to Wasserman Schultz, and we'd start uncovering the layers of corruption in South Florida. And nothing happened. We had a Republican governor at the time, Rick Scott. His office and his Department of Law Enforcement refused to investigate. And you really didn't need to investigate much. When you have sworn videotaped admissions of guilt, any second-year law student of mine could have prosecuted this case. My attorney, who was a Republican election lawyer and a well-connected one, I asked him, why aren't the Republicans prosecuting? They've been after Brenda Snipes forever, and now we've got all of this evidence of felonies. And he got back to me after a couple of weeks and he said, I could expect no help from the Republicans in Tallahassee or in Broward County because they have the same friends as Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I'm like, what do you mean by the same friends? The same lobbyists, the same financiers, same campaign donors, same corporate interests. I spoke to the U.S. attorney, the acting U.S. attorney in South Florida, hoping for a federal prosecution. And we met with him. We spoke to him for almost 2 hours, and he seemed very much on board in moving ahead. He just had to go up to Washington, D.C. for a week of meetings at the Justice Department first. And when he came back after meeting with Rod Rosenstein, that's who we heard, the Deputy Attorney General who appointed the Mueller investigation, was the one who put the kibosh on any prosecution of Brenda Snipes in the Broward Supervisor of Elections office. The federal prosecutor at that point started telling us that it was too complicated a case, that they're used to prosecuting securities fraud. I don't know what's complicated about destruction of evidence. Governor DeSantis came in, and I should say just before DeSantis came in, the 2018 election occurred, and the race for governor and for the U.S. Senate, both were like train wrecks here in Broward County. That days after the election, Brenda Snipes was still finding thousands of ballots. And as they're counting more of these new ballots that materialized, I think it was like sort of a test run for 2020, to tell you the truth. it was a very high stakes and high pressure situation. And Governor Rick Scott eked out his victory for the U.S. Senate over Bill Nelson, and DeSantis eked out his race for governor over Andrew Gillum. They were close. And once the dust settled from that, Rick Scott, on his way out as governor, fired Brenda Snipes. And in his executive order removing her from office, he mentioned very prominently her destruction of the ballots in my case in the judge's order.
Wow.
Now, DeSantis came in, and DeSantis promptly reinstated Brenda Snipes so that she could retire on a $135,000 a year pension. And a few months ago, Lara Logan, the fearless investigative journalist, Lara Logan, asked Ron DeSantis at a forum for his views on hand counting of paper ballots as opposed to electronic voting machines. And his response was very telling, that we didn't want to return to the Stone Age, he said.
Oh boy. Well, the Stone Age of truth and
transparent elections.
And transparent elections. Well, I mean, DeSantis is held up as a, as
an icon, really.
Yeah. An icon, yes. And in fact, he's part of the
swamp, the establishment.
Yes, he's part of the swamp. Thank you for the words. I'm wordless on some of this.
And I say that as somebody. I say that as somebody who's no longer a Democrat. I'm an independent, and somebody who voted for Ron DeSantis not once but twice. But make no mistake, while he's better than the Democratic alternatives on a number of issues, he is still very much an establishment, a corporate establishment figure.
Well, hasn't it really shown time and time again that it doesn't matter what party it is? We've been given two parties. And that's it. We are not given the right to choose who we really would like to have, and to have to make a choice between two parties where neither candidates really serve our needs, our constitutionally guaranteed rights in this lifetime. So maybe we could go a little bit now into the Brunson brother case, because of course, not only was that election stolen that you ran in 2016, but the 2020 election was stolen on the federal level. And the Brunson brothers in Utah have filed a lawsuit basically against Congress for breach of fiduciary duty to investigate the complaints at that election. And again, electronic voting machines are the common denominator in all of these. And I think they've been around since 2002. So could we even say that we haven't had open and fair elections ever since the electronic voting machines came in?
Yeah, I am right there with you, Kathleen. I really am. Back in 2004, in the presidential election, Ohio was a very mysterious result. Diebold were the machines there. Diebold ends up getting broken up and their assets basically transferred to election systems and software and Dominion Voting, two of the three companies in the cartel. The Brunson lawsuit is an interesting one, and I wrote about it in the Gateway Pundit. When I first saw that it was on the Supreme Court's docket, I was shocked that it had made it that far. And I've always been, and I still am, rather pessimistic that anything will come of the Brunson lawsuit. And it's not because of anything other than that the courts, I think, just won't go there. There's some things that establishment judiciary will not do. The Brunson's lawsuit basically says that 385 members of Congress on January 6th of 2021 should have, instead of rubber stamping the electoral college electors, should have been investigating serious allegations of election rigging. And they failed to do so, and that by failing to do so, they violated their oaths to protect and defend the Constitution. What was missing in the Brunson lawsuit that I went into in the Gateway Pundit piece was the intelligence community's assessments. Um, Under an executive order that President Trump had signed, I believe in 2018, dealing with foreign election interference, it required the Director of National Intelligence, at the time of the 2020 election, that was John Ratcliffe. It required that Director of National Intelligence, who oversees 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, to report to Congress and to the administration by December 18th, I believe, 45 days after the November election, to report on any foreign election interference. And when December 18th, 2020 came, Ratcliffe did not submit a report as required. He did make public statements that were on 60 Minutes, on CBS News, excuse me, and also in the press. The public statements to the effect that the intelligence community is somewhat divided, that they found significant foreign election interference. Some intelligence agencies believe it was sufficient to overturn the outcome of the election, but some don't. Okay.
Wow.
So now there are 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. And of course, the CIA was an implacable foe of Donald Trump. But you also had other intelligence agencies, such as the Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Homeland Security, and a few others that perhaps were maybe different-minded than the CIA. So when Ratcliffe failed to produce his report to Congress on December 18th, you would think that members of Congress, as guardians of the Constitution and fiduciaries of the American people, should have been asking some questions, should have been demanding a report before January 6th. They did not do that whatsoever. And January 6th comes and goes without any clarity as to whether there was foreign election interference and how significant it was. After January 6th, Ratcliffe does submit his report in which he lays it out that there was a split within the intelligence community. He believed that there was hacking of the election coming from outside powers. I think they were focused on China, Pakistan, and Iran, if I remember correctly. Now, when Biden gets into office, of course, he gets a new national intelligence director who then flip-flops and says, no, Russia was involved, not China, and it was not significant. So this is politicized intelligence at this point.
Well, and it's also another, just in very simple terms, pointing fingers to move away from what the real problem is. But if we go way back, if we go back to the Civil War and the infiltration of Marx and Engels in their Communist Manifesto and all the other writings in the late 1840s and 50s, and the massive amounts of communists that began to infiltrate America with their influence that went unabated. And then we see the spread of communism all throughout Europe after the Russian Revolution in 1917, and then we continue to see country after country succumb to communist overthrow. And today, communism in this country, our government's communist. I mean, we would not have this kind of response if this was not a complete tyrannical communist overthrow. Can you speak to that?
When you look at what we have right now, it is a system of centralized tyranny. And sometimes I think it looks more like it's fascist, sometimes it looks communist. And there are such similarities between fascism and communism. The state is supreme, you can say, in a communist system. The state controls the private sector, there's no private property. Economic activity is dictated by the state, and it's all centralized. Well, in the kind of corporate fascist state, it's not much different. Now, there's private property for the wealthy corporate interests, really, who I think Mussolini said under fascism, it's basically a merger between state and corporate. And I think that's what we see here in the United States. What I find interesting is when you take a look at the history of the 20th century, who was helping to fund the rise of Adolf Hitler and the rise of communism in the Soviet Union and elsewhere? You know,
The
these
United
were
States was.
Wall Street interests. Wall Street interests were doing both. And in the United States, those Wall Street interests were implicated in an attempted coup plot against Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, I believe it was. It was known as the business coup. And that's not taught very much in American history. This was Smedley Butler. Are you familiar with this at all?
I know the name, but
Smedley Butler was the most decorated Marine in American history at the time, and he was the commandant at the Marine Corps camp, I think, in Quantico. Prior to Roosevelt's victory in 1932, President Hoover had called out the Army to clear what was known as the bonus Army, the World War I pensioners, World War I veterans who had marched on Washington, D.C. to demand their pensions. And this was a very violent move by Hoover to put down this encampment of World War I veterans by force. So when Roosevelt came in, Smedley Butler was approached by Wall Street bond traders and given an offer that they would raise the money. The Wall Street interest would raise the money, I think $1 million or $2 million. And they would help to finance bringing the World War I veterans back to Washington, D.C., and essentially pushing for a coup with Smedley Butler to be the new Fuhrer. This is 1933. Hitler had just come into power. You know, these kind of fascist ideas were prominent, I think, at the time in many ways. Butler played along with them. He wanted to find out who was really behind this. So he played along like he was interested, and then he blew the whistle, and he blew it very loudly. And there were House congressional hearings on this, and Butler testified. And the House ultimately concluded that Butler was telling the truth, and yet nobody was ever arrested. The bond trading firm, it turns out, was the same firm that Prescott Bush, the father of George Herbert Walker Bush, was a partner at. So this was Wall Street, and the same Wall Street interests that would then finance the Nazi war machine.
Well, you know, we have to look at central banking, and we have to look at who runs the central banking and whose names were on the list and are today even in the Federal Reserve Agency. And we have to take a look at the Bolsheviks and who made up the bulk of the Bolshevik revolution. And it's the same group of people. It's the same, you know, mindset, the same central bankers. You print your money, you control all the banks, and you own all the governments. And I know one thing about Germany and Hitler's work with the German people was that he was against the central banking system, and that is one of the reasons why why the country was blockaded, why there was the Judea War against Germany, why there was tremendous assault against the German people, the starvation between the two world wars. It was this was all led by the bankers, the central banking that runs our country today and runs our elections. I mean, it's not a surprise to see that the financiers are the ones that determine the outcome of everything.
Well, there's no doubt that the central bankers are calling the shots in the United States and have been for quite a long time. The last president who seemed to have made some attempt to rein in the Federal Reserve was President Kennedy. Ever since then, we've had president after president who's gone along with the Federal Reserve until Donald Trump. And Trump was very vocal in his opposition to Fed policy. Trump had on the walls of the Oval Office a portrait of Andrew Jackson, the president who had taken on the second bank of the United States. He called it the Monster Bank, and he defeated it. He vetoed its recharter. I think the history of Nazi Germany is a little bit more cloudy than perhaps you were stating. I think central bankers helped bring Hitler to power, and Hjalmar Schacht was the Rothschild man in Germany and a very strong ally of Hitler to bring Hitler to power. When Hitler got into office, he started to pursue what were essentially Keynesian policies of infrastructure investment, building the Autobahn, putting Germans to work. And those were popular programs. So that helped end the Depression in Germany before anywhere else. But I don't believe Hitler really got full control over the central bank, and I don't think he even tried to. Throughout World War II, when you look at the real rate of interest, so the rate on government bonds minus the inflation rate, the U.S. had lower real interest rates throughout World War II than did Nazi Germany. Hitler, I don't think, ever really conquered the central bankers, and I'm not sure he really tried to. Roosevelt may have done a better job temporarily during World War II in particular of neutralizing the Federal Reserve and requiring them to basically purchase bonds at any price to keep the yield very low for the wartime mobilization.
Well, I guess my own look at that. I mean, Roosevelt and Churchill and the Rothschilds and they were all part of the central banking system. They were all part of the world order. They were all a part of the group that is basically controlling what is going on today. And and so when you oppose something that large, which is what Hitler did, he also opposed the whole communist spread throughout Europe that was happening, and he saw that in what was going on in Russia. So when we see that kind of force of central banking, because the central banking first began in Europe and then obviously in this country with the Federal Reserve, and and the whole story behind that of how the Federal Reserve was passed by Congress. I mean, that's a whole
Well,
other deal.
that's the creature of Jekyll Island, where the New York bankers came down to Jekyll Island, Georgia. They drafted the Federal Reserve Act, presented it to President Woodrow Wilson, and then the bankers pretended publicly to be against the bill, the bill that they had drafted. And of course, it was only pretend opposition.
Yes, exactly. So, we've continually throughout history, the entire history of this country and this entire history of the world has always been written by the victors. And so as we peel the layers off the onion, we see the tremendous lie that is one huge lie. And it's similar to, to what we see in everything today as we pay attention. Now, I want to be very cognizant and respectful of your time. I know you have, I have a time limitation. Maybe you could just, in a very brief moment, speak to this financial disaster that is taking place and unfolding. And I know it's not giving you much time.
No, it's okay. I have about another 10 minutes. Uh, the collapse of these banks, the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and now there's a whole bunch of other banks. I think Moody's put 6 more banks on a watch list, downgraded their debt. It seems to be kind of a panic that's directed at regional banks. I think the end game is probably to increase concentration of banking assets and deposits in fewer and fewer of the big banks' hands. It might also be, if not intended, very well might be intended, but whether it's intentional or not, I think those who want to have a central bank digital currency are going to try to use this crisis to advance that agenda. In many ways, the kind of banking crisis that exists suddenly, it's not sudden, it's a result of our failures to confront the crisis of 2008 in a legitimate way. When you look back at 2008, much of the big banks and the entire US banking system was probably insolvent and certainly illiquid. And there were a number of paths that the Obama administration could have pursued. They had the support of many interests, I think, at that time to nationalize the banks. And that sounds perhaps Oh, nationalization sounds like not realistic. And yet in 2008 and early 2009, even Alan Greenspan and John McCain and a bunch of others were talking about this as a real possibility to nationalize the banks. In the 1990s, Sweden had nationalized its three main banks, and it's a smaller country, so it had three banks that dominated. And the advantage of actually nationalizing the banks in 2008 would have been to clean them out from the inside, to basically fire the management, put in your own team, clean them out from the inside. You can investigate from the inside and see what kind of speculative and illegal trading they may have been doing, and put an end to it. By not nationalizing the banks, how do you really find out what the nature of their operations were? Through regulators who are co-opted, or what you're going to try to sue to see their books. They're going to lawyer up. So we didn't go in the direction of punishing the bankers, basically nationalizing the banks, even if just temporarily. I mean, you could always privatize them after you clean them up. We did nothing to shut down the global casino. We didn't ban derivatives. So the derivatives market has gotten only that much bigger. It's now, Ellen Brown has estimated it might be $1 quadrillion in notational value. So the global casino is still operating in a big way. And you had a decade of trickle-down monetary policy where the Federal Reserve was essentially printing money and buying treasuries, not just treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, repos, all kinds of, it was just pushing trillions of dollars into the banking system, hoping it would trickle down to, working folks, middle-class people in this country. What would have been a better strategy, again, would have been to put an end to the casino, an end to all of that, those subsidies, those trillions of dollars of central bank subsidies to the banks, and instead try to have a program, a jobs and infrastructure program for Main Street America, putting people back to work and educating them, and having a bottom-up recovery instead of a top-down, trickle-down approach. But 10 years of this strategy has painted the Fed into a corner, where the Fed wants to raise interest rates, probably to protect the value of the dollar and to try to put an end to the inflation we see. But as it's raising interest rates, you start seeing how fragile the financial markets and the banking system are. So there's not a lot of room to do that. And finally, I'd say that just the strategy of raising interest rates and pushing for recessions to end an inflation spiral might not make much sense if the causes of the inflation are really because of supply chains falling apart. The supply chain started to fall apart during COVID shutdowns. They've continued ever since. Sanctions against Russia has hurt the supply of energy. And then there's been a very mysterious wave of explosions at food processing plants, fires at food processing plants, train derailments. All of these are supply side shocks. Raising interest rates and throwing people out of work is not going to bring down those inflationary pressures.
Well, you said a tremendous amount there, Tim. And I mean, if we go back and just look at the Fed itself, the entire Federal Reserve System is intended to implode based on inflation, because all it is printing money out of thin air. It's not backed. It's backed by, supposedly oil, but
Oh,
no.
well, the full faith and credit of the American taxpayer, supposedly.
Right. And bailing out all of these banks. Whose
Yeah.
money is bailing out these banks? It's us.
Right.
So, and so this entire scenario that you just painted is a full watercolor of a picture that shows this tremendous attack against our lives, because it implodes our own capacity to be able to you know have a thriving business. 1 out of 5 of the businesses were considered non-essential at the beginning of COVID, and yet a banking system, a bank is no more than a private corporation doing business for profit. And we know today that the courts are no longer courts of justice. They are listed on Wall Street, on Dun and Bradstreet, traded on Wall Street, and so they are just doing business for profit. So all of this is all led, is it not, by the central banking system that is in the hands of a very few people, and the rest of us are truly just mopping up the disasters that are put in front of us.
The cycles of boom and bust, the periodic financial crises that we see throughout our history, and they only get worse as the central bank is sort of more independent and more in control. It's a system of fractional reserve banking, and it's the largest banks that pretty much control the Federal Reserve System. I've said that the Federal Reserve is a central bank that's captured by design, like no other federal agency, really. And I think it's a walking blemish on the Constitution. There have been a number of constitutional challenges to the Fed over the decades, and the challenges make their way in the federal courts up to the D.C. Circuit, so the gatekeeper to the Supreme Court. And the challenges basically are a number of legal theories behind the challenges. One is that the Fed is an unconstitutional delegation by Congress of its lawmaking authority, that it violates what used to be known as the private non-delegation doctrine. Congress can delegate its lawmaking powers to administrative agencies if there's an intelligible principle behind the delegation, and it's delegating the power to public administrative agencies that rely on Congress for its budget and budgetary oversight, where the president appoints the officers that direct the public agencies. The Federal Reserve, it's a delegation of lawmaking power to a private entity, not a public entity. The Federal Reserve doesn't rely on Congress for a penny of its budget. It basically creates money out of thin air, and that pays for its budget. The Federal Reserve System is not just a board of governors in the United States. The board of governors is bad enough. These are 7 governors appointed by the president to 14-year terms. I mean, 14-year terms is longer than 3 administrations, presidential administrations. And the board of governors doesn't alone decide monetary policy and all of these, Fed maneuvers. This is done through the Federal Open Market Committee that includes the presidents of the 12 privately owned, privately directed regional Federal Reserve banks. So there's where you get the private delegation theory, claims against the Fed. Also that the Fed violates the appointments clause of the Constitution because the president's not appointing those presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks that are setting government policy. Now, some of those challenges have made it to the D.C. Circuit, and the D.C. Circuit has dismissed each of these. When it's a private plaintiff, they say that the private plaintiff lacks standing to sue the Federal Reserve. We can't show that we've been harmed by the Federal Reserve. We're not in privity of contract to the Federal Reserve, and that there's no redressability. So those are all part of the whole standing doctrine. When it's a U.S. senator who brings the lawsuit and says, I, as a senator, have been harmed because I don't get to vote on the confirmation of a federal officer, the Federal Reserve Bank presidents, the D.C. Circuit has dismissed under a theory that it seems like they invented just for these cases, a doctrine called equitable discretion, where the D.C. Circuit will exercise its equitable discretion not to rule on this. Why? No apparent reason.
Doesn't that bring us right back to where we started at the beginning, where the First Amendment allows us redress of government? And so all of these other congressional, really unconstitutional congressional passages that have occurred over the many decades, that they're all unconstitutional. But if we go back to the original organic Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we of course have the right to redress government, and that of course we have standing under the Constitution. So it's just that if the wolves are guarding the hen house, then of course we're not going to be allowed to have any any consolation or any win in any of these arenas. But we just
well, that's right.
Original documents.
And if Americans band together to try to protest and seek redress of grievances, We see an FBI and other intelligence agencies that will infiltrate and discredit those kinds of public protests. I think there's so many markers of where the U.S. fell off the rails. And one of those markers was during the Obama administration. I think it was in 2014, Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act amendments, the NDAA amendments. And in that bill that he signed, it abolished basically the protections under a 1951 statute called the Smith-Mundt Act, which had prevented the CIA from engaging in propaganda here in the United States directed at American citizens. And ever since then, I think the United States, American citizens might be the most propagandized victims in the world, that other peoples around the world might have a better idea of what's actually happening here in this country and around the world than we Americans know. And, if the intelligence agencies are engaging in propaganda directed at the American citizen, well, look at all of the power they have to push their narratives. 6 major corporations, big corporate conglomerates, now control 90% of the TV, radio, and cable broadcast and print media. Back in the 1970s, there was something called the Church Committee. And my students don't learn this, and I bet you many of my colleagues don't even know about the Church Committee. It's worth looking up. Senator Frank Church was a Democrat from Idaho, and in the mid-1970s, he headed the Senate Committee on Intelligence Oversight, and they held hearings on basically CIA wrongdoing. And this is how Americans first learned that the CIA was engaged in foreign coups and assassinations and things like that. Well, one of the revelations that came out during the Church Committee hearings was Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA was basically paying off several thousand American journalists and editors to push their narratives, basically to push propaganda. And, when you think about the First Amendment, that it protects our free speech, well, the First Amendment is violated if the government is trying to censor us. It's also violated if the government is crowding out our speech by pushing narratives, fake lies, and propaganda. So that was the world in the 1970s, where the CIA had to pay off thousands of journalists and editors. And when you look up Operation Mockingbird, I think the Wikipedia entry says that the CIA director at the time assured the American public that the CIA was no longer doing it. They had shut down Mockingbird. That CIA director at the time was George Herbert Walker Bush. So, what then happened to Mockingbird? Why pay off thousands of editors and journalists when instead you can consolidate the media sector into the hands of 6 corporate conglomerates, and really all you have to do is infiltrate the boards of directors and top management levels?
Yeah. Wow. We could go on, and I must be respectful of your time limitation, Tim. So I really appreciate it. Did you want to make a final comment before we end this?
I'd just like to thank you for having me on. We talk about all of these systems of social control and narrative control, media control, and it's very hard for people to actually understand what's happening, just the facts of what is happening in this world. And I have so many loved ones that get their main sources of news from the establishment media, whether it's television or the New York Times or something like that. And they think they're very informed, and they're really not. So it makes shows like your program so important. It might seem like we're up against a giant machine, and we are, but if all of us are pushing at the same time and standing up to speak the truth and spreading the word to others, that's really the only way that things are going to change in this country. I remember back in the waning days of the Soviet Union, you had a communist party-controlled media there. And it got to the point where most people, most Soviet citizens, most Russians, they just didn't even believe the propaganda anymore. And the real speech, the real free speech that was going on around dinner tables, was going on, away from the organs of the state. And I think much the same is beginning to happen here. there was a recent survey of public attitudes towards the media in their countries, and the United States came in last for public trust in their own media. So, when Trump was when he was first saying that it was a fake media, fake news, people were maybe rolling their eyes, some people, but I think more and more people realize that that's the truth, that we do have a fake media, that they're corporate owned, corporate controlled. They rely on advertisements from big pharma, and they're directed by intelligence agencies. The same with social media. We've seen the revolving door between the FBI and CIA and Twitter and Facebook. And those are gigantic forces that we're up against. And the only way we can fight it is to keep our vibrations high, to keep speaking the truth and banding together.
Thank you, Tim. And to add just briefly to that, education is extremely powerful and potent. And without being an educated populace, we do not stand a chance. So thank you for bringing this information to us.
Thank you, Kathleen.